Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you've joined us for today's session, Navigating DCAA Compliance Audits with Confidence. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% or 3 of the 4 polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. Polling questions will appear within the slide window. To participate in the polls, please click on your answer and be sure to hit the Submit button to record your response. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry, if you can't download your CPE certificate today, we'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet to receive credit. The attendance sheet is available in our slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit only can be awarded to participants registered as themselves, and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, before we get started, I want to acknowledge our recent big news that Moss Adams is joining forces with Baker Tilly to create a new firm, one designed to serve the needs of the middle market. And this is really exciting. You can read more about it on our website from the link in your console. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Rich Weber, partner here at Moss Adams.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rich Weber. I'm a partner in the Los Angeles office here at Moss Adams. And I work closely with government contractors, really in federal income tax and contracts compliance. And I primarily support clients in defense, technology, as well as professional services. And now I'll turn it over to Sheila to introduce herself.
Thank you, Rich. I'm Sheila Herrera. I'm a partner in the Albuquerque office. And so I've been with Moss Adams about 19 years and spent a significant amount of my time working with government contractors, both on the financial statement audit side, along with making sure that contractors, meet compliance for federal acquisition regulation, also do some compliance under 2 CFR 200 as well.
Thank you, Sheila. So I'd like to highlight just some of the specialized services that we offer in our group here at Moss Adams. We offer a broad range of assistance with government contracting, indirect rate development, DCAA audit support, cost accounting system design that aligns with FAR requirements, CMMC compliance, and a whole host of other specialized services. So I always like to mention what our team does here. So really looking into the learning objectives for this webinar, today we're going to focus on the DCAA audit process and really equip you with hopefully essential skills for successful audits. So hopefully, as we get going, we're going to start by exploring the different types of DCAA audits, such as pre-award and incurred cost audits. Understanding these will really help you prepare effectively. Next, we're going to discuss how to develop audit-ready documentation and kind of what that looks like. And you'll learn really about some of the key documents and record-keeping practices necessary for a smooth audit process. And then we're going to cover some of the common audit pitfalls and strategies to really mitigate risks before, during, and after the audit. Being proactive can really significantly enhance your audit outcomes. And then finally, we're going to look at how to respond to audit findings and deal with the DCAA auditor and also, implementation of any corrective actions. And so really knowing how to address issues post-audit is really crucial for maintaining compliance. And so hopefully by the end of this training, you'll be well prepared to at least have a general understanding of how to navigate the DCAA audit process. And so, thanks again for joining us today. So now let's go ahead and get started. It looks like we already have a polling question. So I'll turn that over to Amy, please.
All right, thank you, Rich. So the first polling question is up, and they are located right on the slides that we're presenting. And if you can't see it, you may need to hit F5 to refresh your console. So the first one, has your organization ever undergone a DCAA audit? Your options are A, yes, recently, B, yes, but it's been a while, C, no, but we expect one soon, or D, no, and not expecting one. And then to respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose, and then make sure you hit that submit button. Looks like most have responded. We'll do another 5 seconds. And here are the results.
Thanks very much, Amy. So it looks like we've got about 55% have not gone through an audit and not really expecting one, and then about 20% recently, and a little bit, it's been a while. And so hopefully the not expecting one holds true. So always a good thing. So, first let's, just to level set on what we're even talking about. So what is the Defense Contract Audit Agency? So it's commonly known as the DCAA. It's a term that you hear a lot in government contracting, especially as it pertains to defense contractors and defense contracting. So this is an agency under the DoD that plays a key role really in overseeing how government contractors manage federal funds. So, the DCAA's mission is really to provide audit and financial advisory services to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used properly when the government contracts, with private companies for goods and services. So while it's housed within the DoD, DCAA, also performs audits for civilian agencies under interagency agreements. And so, especially when contracts involve cost reimbursement or time and materials pricing structures. So it's really important to note that DCAA does not award contracts and doesn't make decisions about which contractors get selected. Their role is strictly focused on the financial integrity of those contracts. So evaluating whether a contractor's costs are allowable, reasonable, and allocable under federal regulations like the FAR and cost accounting standards. So kind of think of the DCAA as the financial compliance arm in the contracting process. And so, they really help ensure contractors have proper systems in place, from accounting and billing to labor charging and indirect cost allocations, and they're billing the government fairly. So understanding what DCAA is and what they're looking for is really essential for any contractor hoping to do business with the federal government. And so now we can kind of talk about, grounding ourselves really in what the overall purpose of DCAA audits is. And really, it's to assess the adequacy of a contractor's business systems and allowability, allocability, and reasonableness of costs charged to government contracts. So it's not just about catching fraud or financial statement misstatement, though those items are obviously important. It's really about verifying that contractors comply with federal regulations, including the FAR and cost accounting standards, and the taxpayer dollars are spent efficiently and transparently. So, depending on the type of audit, DCAA might focus on a contractor's indirect cost rate proposal, incurred costs, their timekeeping system, or even a pre-award accounting system survey. And each audit type serves to evaluate really whether a contractor can reliably manage and track costs on government-funded work. So ultimately, the goal is really about accountability and risk mitigation, making sure that the government only pays what it should and that contractors are operating with sound internal controls and compliant practices. It's worth noting that there's been a lot of activity at the federal level in 2025 with DOGE, as well as an executive order more recently that discussed kind of an overhaul to the FAR, and those items are constant and ongoing through this year. But this presentation really discusses what's in the regulation presently. So next slide, we kind of level set and provide here an overview of kind of the 4 different types of DCAA audits. And really these all of these are here to ensure compliance with government contract regulations. And really the audits help assess a contractor's systems, cost estimates, and incurred costs, like we just discussed. But let's go over kind of the different types here. So pre-award surveys before awarding a contract, the government may request a pre-award survey really to evaluate whether a contractor has the financial capability, accounting system, and internal controls necessary to perform on a cost reimbursable contract. So you ordinarily wouldn't see a pre-award survey on a fixed price contract, but this would mainly apply to cost reimbursable contracts. Forward pricing audits, this is where DCAA reviews contractor cost estimates and forward pricing proposals to really ensure they're reasonable, allowable, and allocable. And so these audits really help the government negotiate fair contract prices. And then the next box here, incurred cost audits. And this is really where DCAA itself verifies that a contractor's claim costs are allowable, allocable, and reasonable under the FAR. You're going to hear those words a lot. And really that they comply with the contract terms to ensure accurate billings to the government. And then you've got, special or other audit types, and these are based on agency requests, and they can include, compliance audits, labor floor checks, closeout audits, or audits related to defective pricing claims. And these audits really may be initiated in response to allegations of fraud waste or abuse, or to investigate specific concerns raised by contracting officers or other stakeholders. And really, each of these audits plays a crucial role in maintaining the integrity and cost effectiveness of government contracting. And so understanding them really helps contractors prepare and remain compliant. So next slide here, preparing for DCAA audits. So, this really begins with understanding what type of audit may be performed and why it was triggered. So what's the audit type? Why is it happening? And so DCAA, conducts several types of audits, and knowing the scope really can help you, focus on your preparation efforts. So, a great starting point is to review the DCAA audit program itself, if that's available. Typically, these are public information available, even through, online. And so, they publish audit guidance and checklists, including portions of their contract audit manual and audit programs directly right on the DCAA website. So, and these documents really give insight into what auditors are trained to ask, what they'll look for, how they'll assess compliance, and it's really an invaluable resource for any contractor trying to stay ahead of an audit. And so, a huge component of preparation obviously is documentation. So DCAA will want to see supporting records for labor charges, indirect cost rates, policies, and possibly even fringe benefit allocations. And your system should be both compliant and easy to navigate during an audit. It's worth noting that when the term system is used as it pertains to DCAA audits and compliance, it's not referring specifically or solely to the IT system. It's the entire accounting system, including policies and procedures, what your internal processes are for processing invoices, for example, and timekeeping and so on. So it's not just an IT system or ERP that they're referring to. You really on the training side, you want to make sure your team is trained. So particularly on timekeeping and labor charging, DCAA places a lot of emphasis on accuracy and integrity of labor reporting. So your staff should understand their roles and responsibilities. And then, we recommend, in preparation for a DCAA audit, to conduct kind of internal mock audits, or at least walkthroughs with someone familiar with DCAA expectations. And that's really going to help uncover gaps and kind of allow time to fix problems really before you're under the microscope with the DCAA auditor. So. Understanding the audit scope and objective, that's obviously one of the most important first steps in working with the DCAA, is to understand what their scope is and what's the objective. It shouldn't be, an unknown as to what the objective is. And so when you receive notice of an upcoming audit, you want to carefully review the engagement letter or the audit request, and both really. And it should outline the scope, what the auditor intends to evaluate, and any documentation or access that they're requesting. You also want to confirm the time period under review. Is the auditor looking at a single year's incurred cost, a current proposal, your accounting system readiness? Next, you're going to want to clarify which contracts or cost elements will be in focus. Sometimes DCAA focuses narrowly on a specific rate or proposal, but other times it's more broad. And then most importantly, you're going to want to determine what the auditor is trying to accomplish. So are they validating your indirect cost rate, reviewing claim costs for allowability, evaluating your ability to segregate direct and indirect costs. And so knowing this allows you to gather relevant documentation and really prepare your internal team with the right mindset. So understanding the scope and objective really allows you to focus your energy, avoid kind of unnecessary delays and really manage the audit process more proactively. So, and now we come to our next polling question. So I will turn it over to Amy.
All right, thank you. So the second of 4 polling questions is, what stage is your organization in regarding DCAA compliance? A, fully compliant, B, mostly compliant but with gaps, C, in the process of becoming compliant, D, just starting, or E, not applicable. And then also just a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. All right, most have responded. Make sure you click that submit button so that it registers your response. And here you go.
Thank you so much, Amy. It looks like we've got a lot of NAs, so we've got 46%. It's the DCAA compliance is not applicable, so we've got folks on here for CPE or otherwise and just learning what it's all about, so that's great. And then we've got kind of a range on the other answers there, so good stuff, and thank you. And now I will pass it over to Sheila for the next slide.
Thanks, Rich. And so we'll just start going through some of the DCAA specific things here, along with some best practices. But just wanted to give a flavor for, some of the things that are already out there as public information. This slide shows just a small sample of dozens of audit programs that the DCAA publishes. They're incredibly valuable resources because they lay out exactly what the auditor is looking for step by step. So it's kind of a magic mirror, magic ball, if you will, of all the things that they may be asking for along the way. And so if you were to go to, for example, program like 17740 on here, those are used specifically for pre-award surveys of prospective contractors and are typically conducted. These audits are done, typically before an award of a cost type contract is awarded, really to verify that the contractor's accounting system is adequate. They're looking to make sure that you can incur the cost appropriately and that you have everything kind of ready to go before the contract even starts. And then you have other ones on here like CAS 403, 404, 405, compliance audits. These ones apply to larger CAS covered contractors and so may not apply to some of our smaller contractors that are listening here. The DCAA has made these, publicly available on their website, and we always recommend that you review them as part of a guide, to help make sure that your organization understands kind of the steps that are involved that they're going through on their side. So you can find them here on the link below that we've included. You can also just Google kind of DCAA directory of audit programs. It just helps you anticipate any requests that they may be asking for, starting to gather supporting documentation you may need, any processes or systems that you may need to correct gaps on to align with some of this audit criteria is very helpful along the way. And so really, how do you make sure that you're successfully managing a DCAA audit? And so it's not just about having good records at the end of the day, it's about having sometimes the right people in place and clearly defined roles and responsibilities throughout the audit process. So you want to start by really identifying and appointing a primary audit liaison. Who's the person that's going to be the main point of contact for the auditors and responsible for coordinating all of the internal responses, all of the documentation that needs to be gathered. Ideally, this person, has a strong understanding of the company's accounting system at the end of the day and any access to key personnel that they may need within the organization. And then from there, you want to really build out, who are going to be the other individuals that will be part of this audit process. And sometimes that's not just finance or accounting like you might be thinking, but it may also be people like program managers that really have an in-depth understanding of the contract. You may need to include your HR team for some of the information they may need related to payroll or documentation. Often IT is involved because you could be looking at things like security and access, IT structure. Some of the specific, DoD items may be included in there as part of the audit process. And then really whoever from contracts needs to be involved. And so each function maybe ask for data or explanations depending on the scope of the audit. And so really you want to make sure your team is familiar with the contract requirements, especially if the audit ties back to specific clauses like cost limitations, any kind of billing procedures, for example, or CAS compliance. And then next you want to really assign out, who's responsible, roles and responsibilities are, so that there's no confusion about who's preparing what as part of the process. This reduces, chances of things either getting duplicated or missed along the way, and really everyone is, has a role to play in the audit process. And so it does often take time to train staff on just making sure that they know exactly what they need to do, and then also training on what appropriate auditor interaction should be. Sometimes you have interactions with outside auditors, and often, that could lead to new questions or misunderstandings. And so really being clear with the team on what, should be communicated when, if you need to be involved in the process as well, if you're the lead, what does that look like? So they understand as well. And then you want to have internal, subject matter experts along the way who can explain cost allocations. If you have system configurations, often some of these areas are very complex or complicated. You may have specific policies that they may be looking at, and often there may be one individual that kind of takes ownership of those specific policies. And so you want to have those individuals available so that the auditors can speak to them because they are closest to the process or to that compliance area. You want to have some sort of document control lead. How do you manage what is coming into you? How do you manage what gets submitted over to the auditors? How do you track requests and verify that those are all done timely? Sometimes control documentation, as you're preparing things. You don't want to have 5 different versions of one document sitting out there. So really understanding what that looks like so that you can be organized throughout this process. Or progress, anticipate requests and keep everyone aligned is very helpful. And also making sure you're keeping your leadership team informed, right? You want to keep whoever needs to know about how the audit process is going, so that if there is something that they need to jump in on or make a decision about, that they're informed throughout the process. Oftentimes that is the CFO individual, a director, maybe a CEO. So just understanding who that individual is that you need to go to if there is communication that needs to happen. And so one of the most important things you can do is stay ahead of a DCAA audit is to gather your documentation early. Some of the more common documentation items that we see often requested for some of the audit types are kind of what's highlighted below is if you're doing an accounting system review, for example, for SF 1408, a lot of times they're looking specifically for labor distribution reports or cost allocation methods. They're looking at the documentation to support your indirect rate or invoices for subcontractors. Some of the things that they may ask for as well as part of the process is they may ask for board meeting minutes. They want to see what's going on within the organization or the company and if there's anything that causes some sort of red flag that they need to be aware of. They're looking for contract briefings and then updated policies and procedure manuals. A lot of times we see different versions of policy and procedures or incomplete versions of policies and procedures. And so making sure that those are really up to date and that you looked at them. They meet kind of the compliance aspect. We often see they only cover financial statement policies and not necessarily some of the federal acquisition regulation policies. And so really digging into what are they going to expect from these policies? Do we have the right, things in place? Do we need to get that in place? Because they will be asking for it as part of the process. Having these, things well organized and ready can really streamline the audit. It reduces the back and forth, and it really shows, the auditor that your systems are robust, they're reliable, that you all can, manage the cost of a cost type contract, for example, or you can show that whatever cost is being incurred in your indirect rate, that you can support that. And so really creating a central location or shared drive internally, so the team can quickly pull and update these materials as needed throughout the process is really helpful. And so maintaining record keeping best practices. Sometimes it's not just about staying organized. Sometimes these audits, are a little bit longer or they go back several years. It's important for audit readiness, financial transparency, regulatory compliance, especially under federal contracts. Some of the best practices, you want to make sure that you have, files that are organized, develop a consistent structure of how documents are stored, for example, whether it's by project, fiscal year, or type of expense. Sometimes clear naming conventions, folder hierarchies make, retrieval faster, it reduces errors. We're seeing a lot more electronic record keeping systems these days. And so they're great because it's, reduces paper. They're often easily accessible for several people, but you really need to understand, what does that look like? How can we search for these records? What's the security over these electronic records? And then even when you have manual records, like where are those manual records kept? Can we get to them easily? A lot of times they go into a storage facility at some point. So can you access them easily when the DCA needs information? And so really understanding what that looks like. And so looking at just periodic reviews of your record retention policies, if there's anything outdated, incomplete, how long do we keep things on file for? What does that look like? Really understanding that. You may have different, types of records that must be kept, some that align specifically for the FAR, some that you have for financial statement purposes or any other kind of specific regulatory requirements. And so having a policy that addresses all of that is really helpful. And then who has access to some of these records? Not everyone should have access to all the records, really defining even in your policy who can view, edit, delete documents based on their role. It just helps, protect that sensitive data, reduces internal risks. And then when you get to the audit process, there's no question about who had access to what, that the documents could be missing, deleted, removed, anything like that. And then backups and disaster recovery, you want to make sure that if you have things that are electronic, that you can get to backup documents. A lot of times we're seeing these days is we have changes in accounting systems, for example, and how do you maintain that historical data? Where does that sit? How does someone get to it at some point? It's really important as part of this process, and even your record retention policy. If you do have a change in accounting system, HR system, payroll system, timekeeping, for example, all of that really needs to be maintained for a potential audit at some point. And then really, cybersecurity as far as record keeping, how do you make sure that you keep records in a safe, protected way? And so next is understanding the DCAA audit methodology. The DCAA, follows a well-defined methodology when conducting audits. They understanding the process, like Rich mentioned, really helps you anticipate what's coming. It helps you stay aligned with expectations. Generally, the audit typically starts with an entrance conference where they go through the scope, the objective, the timeline, and all of that is usually discussed during that entrance conference. From there, they really move to data requests. They test the data, they're analyzing the data, and then at some point they'll have an exit conference with you and ultimately usually issue something to you in writing. Most of the time that comes in some sort of audit report or audit results. The selection of what they look at, it's really risk-based for them. DCAA prioritizes audits based on perceived risk to the government. They evaluate factors like audit results, materiality of costs, contractor size, complexity. This really just helps, determine the depth and the scope of the audit. There's an emphasis, of course, on internal controls and system reviews. And so before digging into transactions, the DCAA, similar to, a financial statement audit, they're really evaluating some of those controls. And then, they're looking at the adequacy of your systems. And so looking at timekeeping, accounting, estimating, if your systems are deemed inadequate, it increases audit risk and can really lead to broader testing, or they'll ultimately disapprove the system at the end of the day, which, may impact you all receiving a contract. And so really knowing how that system is set up and what it takes to be compliant is important. And so they'll go through some sampling techniques and transaction testing. The DCA doesn't test everything. They're not looking at every single dollar. They're not looking at every transaction. They're using statistical and judgmental sampling to test representative transactions. They're looking for consistencies with those policies that I was referring to that you've adopted. So having those policies and procedures in place really is important. And so they're looking to make sure, are you actually following those policies and procedures as well? They're looking at compliance with the federal acquisition regulation and really, making sure that you have sufficient documentation. A lot of times, their thing is if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. And so they really are very strict about what sufficient documentation means and will go through the process of asking for it. And then throughout the audit, the DCAA expects clear, timely responses. They'll often follow up with clarification questions and additional data requests. Just communicate as much as you can so that they understand where you are in the process, and that helps avoid misunderstandings. And then typically at the end of fieldwork, DCAA will hold an exit conference to present any preliminary findings and give the contractor an opportunity to respond. And then usually a formal report is issued, which may include some question costs if they have any system deficiencies or recommendations. And then that gives you a chance to respond with any corrective action if you need to. And so really just staying informed on any kind of methodology allows you all to be better prepared, avoid any surprises, and just have that effective communication that you would with any auditor. And so let's just walk through kind of what you would expect during the actual execution of a DCA audit. So most of the time, your DCA auditors are pretty professional. They're fact-driven. They don't expect a lot of hand-holding. They will not advise you necessarily on how to correct issues. They're there to independently assess and really, make sure that you're meeting the compliance that they're after. Communication is generally very formal with everything documented. You may interact through secure portals, email, often secured or structured interviews. They want to get their information so that they can do what they need to do at the end of the day. And so timelines may vary. Most audits run several weeks to several months, depending on complexity. I will say the scope creep is real. At some point, if the auditors start uncovering inconsistencies or gaps in what they're expecting, they will start digging further and further. And so the audit at some point could expand. And so just be prepared for multiple touch points, not just a single round of questions. And, they could have a second round of requests as they get through kind of the first round of requests. Auditors often want to speak with staff who handle timekeeping, billing, or accounting, not just kind of the management team. It's crucial that those employees understand your internal control policies and don't improvise on responses. If they don't know, just tell them, they'll get back to them at some point so that they understand, like, hey, they're not answering something, they're just guessing on. A brief audit briefing with staff, goes a long way in that situation, and really, coaching them a little bit on if they're not sure, or if there's another person that needs to get directed to, then they should do that. And then, requests for additional information. They may ask for additional supporting data, explanations. They're often looking for clarification of specific transactions. Sometimes the data that you're providing is vague, or they're not understanding what it is. And so they're trying to get an understanding of what exactly they're looking at. And so some of the audit findings, I think, can include lack of support, for costs. We've seen sometimes where there's just no invoice attached, or there's nothing that shows what the cost is that you've incurred and you've recorded. And so really understanding what that documentation looks like. Inconsistent application of indirect rates. We often see things that are misclassified, not accounting for unallowable costs. Sometimes that gets mixed in with allowable cost, and so that it does impact your rates or what you're claiming on certain contracts. And so some of that does get questioned if the documentation is unclear, or if you have an error in recording something in the accounting system. And so just be, transparent, have the solid documentation, have that alignment. It just, helps everything along the way here. And so here's an excerpt of the DCAA, official audit program. We wanted to show an example of one. Specifically, this one is for a pre-award SF 1408 audit. And so you can see this audit program provides kind of instructions on, how the auditor should follow the steps to complete the audit. And so they'll start with reviewing the system design, your policies and procedures here, to determine if the system is acceptable for use on the cost type contracts. They'll usually start with walkthroughs, is usually how we start looking at the internal controls, having some conversations and discussions with key personnel or individuals responsible for some of these items. And then really looking at, the documentation and observing what those key controls are, those key steps. Similar to a financial statement audit, we do this similar process where we do walk through those controls. And so what they'll do is they'll look at your chart of accounts, your policies, your job cost reports, your timekeeping system reports. They're specifically looking at these items that are noted within the program here. And so typically transaction testing is not required at this stage, but they'll go through documentation, explanation. We've seen them asked to run, certain transactions through the accounting system, for example, to see how the cost is getting accumulated and what documentation you have to support that. So we've seen them do that as part of this process to get comfortable that walkthrough is appropriate. And so they're really looking to make sure, right, that they're evaluating that the system is designed and ready for implementation, even if you don't have anything running through there yet. And so here's just a few more audit steps. So you get a general idea of what they may be looking for. They may be looking for, how is it designed in accordance with GAAP? And so we have some specific things that you have to follow from an accounting perspective under either the FASB or the GASB, for example. Accrual accounting, double entry capability. How is the general ledger structured? How is it reconciled? What does that look like? And then you're looking at compliance for GAAP compliance, general ledger chart of accounts showing cost posting capability, some sample financial reports generated from the system, screenshots of accounting software setup, QuickBooks, Deltek, those types of things. Proper segregation of cost. You're looking to make sure the system, can prevent indirect costs from being charged directly to a contract or vice versa. Allowability, how are those costs segregated? And then really looking at, your chart of accounts, again, direct, indirect, unallowable, how are those transactions being flown through in your general ledger? How does it hit your trial balance, that type of thing? And so it just gives you an example of what, program would look like in the steps that they're following to conduct their audit. So next polling question, I'll pass that over to you, Amy.
All right, thank you. So the third polling question, which type of DCAA audit concerns you the most? And your options are A, pre-award accounting system audit, B, incurred cost audit, C, timekeeping audit, D, floor check or surprise audit, or E, not sure. And while you're responding to that, I do want to remind you that you have the option to submit questions for the presenters in the Q&A window. We do have quite a bit of content to cover, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you. All right, here are the results.
Thanks, Amy. And it does look like indirect cost audit, and then we're not sure what concerns. It sounds like at some point you can get audited in different ways, and so we are seeing more pre-award, accounting system audits, especially at the negotiation process. Incurred cost audits have always been there, but we are just seeing more questions about some of the specific items that DCAA has been looking at. Okay. We'll go over to the next slide here. And so some of the common pitfalls in DCAA audits, even well-meaning contractors run into trouble sometimes during your audit. And so some of the most common things that we see as part of this process is, inadequate timekeeping practices. Time must be recorded daily by the person doing the work and with proper approvals. And so things like pre-filled timesheets, late entries, or supervisors completing time for employees often are big red flags, or just lack of documentation for actual time that's being incurred. And then we see poor cost segregation when there's direct and indirect costs that aren't clearly separated, or when unallowable costs kind of get mixed up into your allowable pools. It really puts your whole cost structure at risk. And so DCAA does expect a clear, logical methodology for how you classify and allocate every dollar. Weak internal controls, if you think of internal controls as your audit armor, kind of, if your policies exist but they're not followed, or if you're only one person and they have control over lots of functions with no proper segregation of duties or checks or reviews, it may cause DCAA to determine that your systems are unreliable. So really understanding what your controls are, how do you make sure that those are evaluated and documented regularly, especially when you change personnel, for example, within the organization. Often those roles and responsibilities need to get re-reviewed. If you're disorganized or you have incomplete documentation, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. DCAA is not the only one that follows this methodology. The AICPA has been very clear about this as well. Documentation is important, and if it's just not documented, it didn't happen. We just, as the auditors, can't take your word for it. And so just be sure your records are not only complete, but easy to find and understand. And so that includes any kind of contracts, invoices, rate support, policies, and source data. And then any kind of inaccurate or non-compliant accounting systems. Your accounting system must align with government requirements, so tracking costs by contract, segregating unallawables, producing data that ties to invoices, rate submissions. If you have off-the-shelf systems, you may need to do some customization sometimes to your chart of accounts to meet the bar. You may have some reporting internally that needs to get done to make sure that all of the cost is getting accurately reported. And then the next item is unsupported indirect cost rate calculations. DCAA will dig into your indirect cost rate proposal if your rate support is a single Excel sheet with hard-coded numbers. How do you tie that back to your accounting system? How do you make sure that you have support for what's in your pools? Be ready to show kind of that full audit trail in how does that tie back to your general ledger, for example? If you can align your general ledger to kind of match what needs to get put into your indirect cost calculations, often that's the easiest way to do things. Unprepared staff during audit interviews, just, DCA often speaks with your employees, not just your CFO. So if your project manager doesn't understand labor categories, or timekeeper describes a process that is different than what's in your written policy, often that creates a finding or some sort of inconsistency that DCAA may dig into. Delays in responding to, the requests. If you're not responding, they may provide you extra time, but you need to make sure that you're communicating if you're not able to get to things. Don't just radio silence them. That really looks bad. They may not approve your audit at some point, or worse, they'll give you an incomplete or unsatisfactory, and then you may need to start the process over again. They could pull your contracts. There could be some other things involved if you're just not responding to them. And then just avoiding any kind of pitfalls when it comes to that. Issues with subcontractor pitfalls, failing to obtain or retain adequate cost and price justification for subcontractor awards. Sometimes you rely on the subcontractor for maintaining that documentation without getting it yourself, and how do they make sure that they're properly documenting things? So even if they're the sub, it's still your responsibility to make sure that some of the cost reimbursable documentation requirements are being met. And same thing with rates and terms and all those things. So just understanding what's in your agreements and what is your responsibility. Okay, so risk mitigation strategies during the audit. Again, even small missteps can escalate. And so just really have a single point of contact for audit communication. Having that one person manage communication with the auditor really helps with mixed messages, any kind of duplicate submissions, any kind of conflicting information. This person should understand your accounting and operations and really be empowered to coordinate responses. Sometimes that's working internally with management as well to provide responses back to the DCAA or the auditors. And so just really be prepared, have that communication open before submission. Don't just send documents as is. Do a quality control review to ensure they are complete, they're consistent, they're clearly labeled. There's nothing in the documents that looks weird, or a lot of times I'll open something, right, and there's something that's keyed incorrectly, or that the linking is not coming through correctly on a document. So really looking at that before it gets to them, just so that if something's messy, we've corrected as much as we can, so we don't have to go back and explain or try to figure out what's going on later. And then aligning the internal team with consistent messaging. Again, if there is people who need to interact, have those sessions up front, what to expect, how to communicate even internally along the way. If something doesn't sound right, look right, how do we make sure that we're responding to that internally so that we can respond back to the auditors. Maintaining that audit log to track requests and responsibilities and responses, who's responsible for what was provided, when does it need to get provided by whom. It just helps stay organized at some point. Respond promptly, timely. I think that's hopefully pretty clear throughout these slides, is that communication is pretty important here. And then any concerns or misunderstandings. Again, if something seems off or the auditor seems like they're requesting out of scope data or misinterpreting your practices, it's okay to ask the question or get some clarifying intent from even them. What's the purpose of this? How just trying to understand what you're needing. Sometimes we've seen other individuals get involved. Maybe your consultants maybe need to get involved. Sometimes it's your counsel gets involved or your contracting officer. And so I think just keep an open mind that maybe there's some things that are getting asked for even along the way that we don't need to include, and so just having an understanding of what is required. Okay, I'm just going to kind of go through these real quick because we're starting to get closer to time here, but risk management, risk mitigation strategies after the audit. And so I think we've covered most things here, but I think the one thing I do want to continue to highlight is just if there is something that does pop up in an audit finding, having an corrective action plan for noted deficiencies so that you can actually correct it, update your internal policies, and then when you get to an audit the next time, all of that has been corrected. There may be instances where DCAA follows up to make sure that you actually follow your corrective action plan. And so just keep that as part of your monitoring process for reoccurring issues or future audits and reviews as well. And then here, I think just, again, some common DCAA audit findings. We've gone through some of these. Some of them can be prevented, obviously, but you want to continue to, continue to train employees and update processes as regulations change, as the organizations change. We've seen a lot of instances this year where the organizations have, grown quite a bit and policies really haven't been updated, or vice versa, where they've downsized and the policies have not been updated, or some of the controls have not been updated. And so as the organization changes, you need to keep that in mind, that you need to get those updated as well. And so having that regular review, whether that's quarterly, annually, whatever you need to do to keep all of your documentation updated is important. And then preparing for future audits, as Rich mentioned, sometimes that's internal mock audits. You want to maintain audit documentation readiness. You want to be ahead of the curve, monitor any changes to any FAR guidance, DCAA guidance, that type of thing. But all of that should, be helpful in improving both your systems and your culture over compliance at the end of the day. Leveraging technology for audit compliance, use of accounting software. Don't just rely 100% on technology, really understanding what is behind your accounting system. How does that documentation get maintained? How do you monitor, review, reconcile, all those things? How do you do that even with all of your IT systems that you have in place? And so really understanding how that could be a tool and how it can be used for audit compliance. And so Amy, I'll let you take over the last polling question here.
All right, thank you. The last one is, do you currently maintain a written accounting policies and procedures manual? And your options are A, yes, comprehensive and current, B, yes, but needs updating, C, no, but planning on developing one, or D, no, and not sure we need one. We're almost to the end here. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them now from the console. And then we're also sending them out via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. All right, here are the results.
Looks like it's a mixed bag. And so I definitely recommend, again, going back to those policies and procedures and just making sure that they're updated. If you don't have one, start working on that. It does take a long time to kind of get something in place. So with Rich, I'll let you close us out.
Thanks everybody for joining today. Really the key points was really understanding DCAA's methodology through these audits and knowing how they kind of scope, test, and communicate really helps you stay prepared. Common pitfalls are really preventable. Things like timekeeping errors, poor documentation, and misclassified costs can really be avoided with the right systems and training. And your audit response matters. Addressing findings with clear and corrective actions and using them as opportunities to improve your controls and policies is really critical. Compliance is not a one-time event. I would say, building processes that make you audit ready all year long through internal reviews, staff training, and updating systems is really, really beneficial. And finally, leveraging technology where you can, using the right tools can really reduce errors and automate compliance tasks and really help you stay ahead of issues before they become findings. So we've got some additional resources noted in the slides that you'll receive with some links to a lot of good information. And here's our contact information. And thank you everybody for joining us today.